So this presentation is going to cover a little bit more about the history of social psychology. So just a little bit more background about the field as a whole to give you some context for what we're about to study. So when it comes to what social psychologists study within the question of how other people have an influence on thoughts, feelings, and behavior, here's some broad questions that we might see in terms of things we're interested in exploring as a field. So very generally, how do other people impact how we might interpret an event, how we feel about ourselves, what we value and believe? So how we process information about something, whether we feel happy about it or sad or angry. And once again, how we feel about ourselves and what we tend to think of as our belief system. One of the things that social psychologists study is how people feel, think about, and behave toward people who are members of a different group. So how we interact with people across lines of difference. We also study attraction and aggression. So when are we drawn to people? When do we become aggressive and why? Helping behavior is another thing that social psychologists study. Under what circumstances do we help others, and what are the factors that go into our helping behavior decisions? These are just some of the things that we're going to be exploring during the course of this semester. So you might have gathered, but I'm a social psychologist. I got my degree in experimental psychology from University of Kentucky, studying under Richard Smith, who's a social psychologist. And this is my area. So when it comes to what I study, I talked a little bit about it in class, but I study things like social emotions. Social emotions can include things like envy and jealousy. And here's a delightful word, schadenfreude. Schadenfreude is pleasure at the misfortune of others. It's a very random thing to study, but that's one of the things that Richard, my advisor, studied, so I ended up studying it as well. And the two of us and several of our colleagues actually wrote a book about it. If you ever want to learn more about schadenfreude, there's a book that I helped to write about it that you can take a look at. I also study things like how the comparisons we make lead to certain emotional responses and the nature of the comparisons and how culture might play a part. So I'm working right now on trying to publish a study that I did with a colleague of mine about comparing people from the United States with people from Saudi Arabia on how they compared themselves against others and the sort of decisions and thought processes that they made. So for example, people from the United States responded differently when asked to compare themselves to everyone in the classroom versus everyone in the university versus everyone in the neighboring university versus everyone in the country than people from Saudi Arabia. They actually differed on a few consistent things that were fairly interesting and suggested that our culture can shape the sorts of decisions we make. One of the things I did my dissertation on was who do we become jealous towards and why? Jealousy and envy are separate things. Envy involves desiring something that someone else has and resenting them for it and seeing yourself as inferior. Jealousy involves the state of having formative attention removed from you and placed onto someone else and being sad, suspicious, and angry about that possibility. So envy involves two people and jealousy involves three. Now, we can have envy be a part of our jealousy. That's certainly something that I have studied, how envy can factor into our jealousy feelings. One of the things that I study specifically is how sometimes we might have different feelings toward our partner than toward our rival. And once again, I also study how the presence of others can have an impact on our emotional responses, including how the presence of others can impact things like awe, A-W-E, awe. So let's talk about a history of social psychology, generally speaking. So as we're going through this, I just want you to kind of think about broad trends And know that I won't test you for specific dates. It's just to give you a sense of context and place in the timeline. I'm not going to say, what year did this happen? Go! So pay attention to names, theories, and broad trends as we move through this part. So social psychology can be thought of as a relatively new science and a relatively new discipline within the field of psychology. So we're about 100 years old, and about 85% of all social psychologists are still living. That number might be a little bit lower these days, but once again, it's a fairly new field. It is still possible to go to social psychology conferences and share an elevator with one of the people who wrote a really impactful paper that was very important. I've done that before. Social psychology is at the intersection of philosophy, general psychology, and sociology. So for example, I regularly use philosophy when I talk about emotions and how they work, because philosophers have spent a lot of time thinking about that. Aristotle wrote a lot about emotions. Folks like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche have talked about things like Schadenfreude and how it works. So this is actually one of my favorite stories about a social psychology study. This is the first social psychology study that was ever done. So this is before social psychology was established as an independent field of psychology. And even in the very early days of social psychology, or really any psychology research, period. So this was done by Norman Triplett in 1895. Once again, the dates aren't important for you to memorize, but Norman was an enormous fan of bicycle races. He followed the bicycle racers very closely. It was a very popular sport back in the day, and they would publish their times for trials. And he became interested in the fact that the people who were riding their bicycles tended to always underperform when they were trying to get their best time as a solo bicyclist compared to when they were racing against others. So he wanted to study systematically how people performed in tasks in the presence and absence of others. So once again, he was a good observer of the human condition, and he was fascinated by the times that he observed in terms of how bicyclists were always slower solo than they were when racing against someone else, about 20%. Any athlete will know this, that you always tend to perform best in competition. It's just one of those things, and he wanted to study it in a systematic way. So he set up a systematic experiment where he randomly assigned children to reel in a fishing line as fast as they could, and half of them were assigned to do so in the presence of others also doing the task, and half of them were assigned to be by themselves. And he found consistent results where the children who were in competition with others were always, on average, faster. So what he discovered was the principle of social facilitation. And social facilitation is the basic concept that people expend more effort when they're in competition with others. Basically, we find the presence of others to be psychologically and physiologically arousing. What this ends up doing is that if we are participating in an easy task, that arousal will drive us and spur us into a better performance. But if we're engaging in a difficult task, that arousal can sometimes work against us and we can make more mistakes. So if it's a task that requires fine motor coordination or requires multiple mental leaps, it can be much more challenging for us to do. This is why it's always easier to play Jeopardy from your chair at home instead of playing it in front of an audience. I studied violin for years and I always hated competitions because I never practiced hard enough to make the tasks easy. So when I got up in front of a judge, that extra arousal would work against me and I would falter and make mistakes. So this also gets more complicated when we take a look at competition and cooperation. So Triplett was specifically studying competition. It turns out that when people are cooperating, the opposite happens. As anyone who's ever done any group work knows, there's a principle known as social loafing, where people expend less effort when cooperating with others in a group. There's all sorts of reasons behind it. Humans are energy misers, where we try to save energy whenever we can. But we've actually studied this, once again, in a systematic sort of way. There's all sorts of different ways to study it, but one of the ways was by people yelling as loudly as they possibly could. And they either had people yelling by themselves as loudly as they could, or with a group of people as loudly as they could. They were able to isolate each individual's decibel level, and people yelling in a group always yelled slightly less loud than when they were yelling by themselves. This is the same with pounds per inch when pulling on a rope. So it's really interesting to note that when we're in competition with other people, we tend to expend more effort, and when we're working with other people, we tend to expend a little less. So that's an interesting set of social psychology phenomena, and you can see how that simple initial task of looking at reeling in a fishing line can get a little bit more complex once you add things like whether the task is easy or difficult, or whether you're competing or cooperating. This is Kurt Lewin, who's the father of modern social psychology. He was a Jewish refugee from Germany. There were a lot of scientists that fled Germany during World War II and right before World War II, and most of them came to the United States. So the United States actually had a huge influx of scientists from every field, biology, physics, chemistry, and psychology, who came to this country. And once here, Kurt Lewin founded a school of social psychology and established a bunch of researchers and trained them in social psychology based out of the United States. So to this day, the U.S. is fairly dominant when it comes to social psychology research. And so, for example, our national conference, the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, it meets in the United States every year, even though there are people from all over the world who are members, because the majority of the members tend to be from the United States. On a fun side note, your fun fact of the day, Kurt Lewin taught many social psychologists who are now fairly well known. One of the social psychologists he taught was John Tybo, who then went on to teach Richard Smith, my advisor, who then went on to teach me. So I can trace my academic lineage straight to Kurt Lewin, which is kind of cool. So Kurt Lewin paid attention to internal and external factors that could have an influence on behavior and to kind of figure that out. But one of the things he was a big fan of is applied psychology. So right from the very start, social psychology was established as an applied field. One of his most well-known quotes is, "No research without action, no action without research," which means to me that it's important not just to study people, but to figure out how to make your world a little better. And it's important to use research when you're trying to make the world better to make sure that it'll be effective. This is one of the bases for why I'm having you do a proposal for a community outreach or a PSA to really try to take what you know about social psychology and apply it to everyday life to try to make the world a little brighter. So he was a big fan of studying social problems and developing applied solutions. So right from the start, social psychology had its feet in both basic and applied research, which we'll learn about in the next video. During the New Deal, he and his crew of social psychologists were put to work studying a variety of social problems faced by the country, including poverty and racism. But once again, this leads to an American-centric perspective, especially in early social psychology research. There's been some surges of research that have been done in Europe. There's some really interesting things going on right now in the Netherlands and other countries, Japan, especially, for example, are also starting to publish more and more research, but it still has that American-centric perspective at its roots. Also, it has German philosophical roots. So, for example, Kurt Lewin came from a family tree that included Karl Stumpf and many other classic German philosophers and thinkers. So, social psychology comes from German philosophical roots and is based fairly firmly in the United States. The very first textbook ever published about social psychology was by Floyd Allport in 1924. This is when social psychology was defined as its own unique field of psychology. So this is when it started being identified as a unique area of psychology. And once again, this textbook is considered to be kind of like the first really good definition of what social psychology is. So right from the very beginning, carefully controlled empirical research was emphasized with a focus on the individual. This is what distinguishes social psychology from sociology. So social psychology focuses on an individual within a group of people or an individual who is impacted by other people, whereas sociology tends to focus more on groups. And once again, the notion of studying how other people could have an impact on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors established social psychology as distinct and unique from other areas of psychology, like cognitive psychology or developmental psychology, that are otherwise experimental. One of the important things to learn about psychology as a field is that, social psychology as a field rather, is that social psychology is responsive to the historical zeitgeist. So whatever's going on in society tends to be reflected in what is studied in the field. Social psychology tends to observe what is going on around it and tends to be responsive to history. So you can take a look at our culture and our society and see that reflected in the sorts of questions that social psychologists ask. So for example, right around World War II, social psychologists were studying morale, leadership styles, and propaganda. After World War II, a lot of social psychologists, especially those German Jews who were fleeing Europe, were studying things like the power of authority, persuasion, and conformity. In 1960s and 1970s, we were studying helping behavior, aggression, and attraction. There was a lot going on in our society back then in terms of civil unrest, protests, the flower power movement, and so it was really interesting to see the emergence of these types of topics. From 1970 to 1990, people started studying more and more things like stereotyping and prejudice. More recent trends include gender, cultural, and racial biases. So we're really starting, for example, to take into account that other cultures might not have the same ways of approaching things that we do, that we take a lot for granted. So more cross-cultural research and more research done by other countries and cultures. So much more of an international focus, which is a good thing. More recent research also takes into account the intersection between social psychology and neuroscience. So for example, foraying into fMRI research and taking a look at brain activation and how it's associated with certain thoughts and feelings that are social in nature. How rejection has an impact on our physical systems. All that other sort of stuff has been more recent. If you take a look at research published in the last 5 years, it tends to be focused on things like fake news and social media and how people are persuaded who have very strong political beliefs. So once again, to be responsive to the current surrounding atmosphere and to pay attention to what's going on in the world around us and then to ask questions of it. I think that makes for a good social psychologist. So as we're going through this semester, I really hope that you pay attention to what's going on around you and to really think about what might be happening and how you might study it in a systematic way.